Okay, and welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a great lunch. So let's welcome Rihards Olups, and he will show us not so common use cases for Zabbix and what's new with Zabbix.
So I almost said good morning, but I guess after the lunch it's maybe not the worst thing to say. So if you're sleepy, then I'll try to bother you a bit. I've been here talking about Zabbix quite a few times now, and it seemed to be a bit strange to just mention like what Zabbix can do. It can do this, this, this all over again with just a couple of new things added. So today I'll try to look at two topics. One of them will be not so common uses of Zabbix. So everybody's monitoring some IT infrastructure. You're maybe monitoring temperature sensors, humidity sensors. Those kinds of things are pretty common by now. And we'll see where Zabbix is used, which is maybe a bit strange, a bit not so common. And well, yeah, I have to talk about the new things that have been developed in Zabbix during the last 2 years, because that's, I guess, the last time I actually have talked to anybody in Nuremberg about what's new in Zabbix. Before I go on with this, who has used Zabbix? Well, some 6 or so people have used it. So you might know at least a bit about the functionality. Nevertheless, a quick overview. Zabbix has quite a lot of different ways to gather the data. That would be the agentless methods that everybody is familiar with. Zabbix also has a native agent available on lots of different platforms. There's the built-in web monitoring, quite a lot of different other ways to gather the data, which I'll skip on today mostly. Once the data is gathered, the data is stored, obviously. There's built-in visualization support with graphical front-end that is provided, bundled with the Zabbix package, built-in alerting with quite flexible and sometimes not so easy to understand escalation, and different methods of alerting are supported out of the box, including a GSM modem, email, and some others. There's support for monitoring Java application servers using JMX. There's a Java gateway component in Zabbix, IPMI support, but that's will be pretty much skipped today. One more thing to advertise a bit regarding Zabbix. There's this component that we call Zabbix proxy, which you can think of as a remote data collector. And it has been available for quite a long time now. It can be placed in remote environments. That can be a customer site, that can be a branch office, that can be a different data center. And this proxy, the Zabbix proxy, can do everything that a Zabbix server can do. So it can act on behalf of the Zabbix server. All the configuration is still controlled by the server. You decide in which direction the connections go. So you can put it in a DMZ, you can put it in a customer location, a very flexible solution. One thing which has been mentioned every now and then in this conference, and which seems to be quite popular reason to choose or not choose a product, is actually how open source is it. And if you woke up early enough to see the first talks of the day, you might remember the introduced term, which I also like quite a lot, which was open source, I think, which was said to be meant to mean something like fake open source or the open core model. We don't like that at Zabbix. We don't do that. And we don't have the enterprise version. We don't have the professional version that you have to pay for. We don't have modules that you have to buy to actually do the monitoring. Zabbix is completely, well, it's true open source. We're not abusing the term. We also promise to stay that way. So don't expect us to go like, oh no, now you have to pay for that functionality or the new version or something like that. Quite recently, I was discussing Zabbix with one large company, and we looked at Zabbix for a week with the technical people, and then the less technical people, more management side, came in, and they had questions like, so, okay, so what's the licensing cost? Well, there's no licensing cost. No, but, okay, yeah, the free thing is there, but how much do we pay to actually use it? That's it, the licensing cost, it's GPL. We don't know what that is, so how much does it cost? Nothing. It took like 5 minutes to actually get that idea to them, because they are involved in selling something very similar just for millions. So the fact that the licensing cost is not there, that you can use it, that there is no vendor lock-in, it was almost like a totally not just a foreign concept. It was just like, that's not on this planet for them. But I think we finally delivered the message that we are a truly open source solution. And now getting to those slightly uncommon monitoring uses, not all of them will be totally serious. Some of them will be a bit less serious than others. And the first example comes from one of the Zabbix developers who use Zabbix to monitor weather forecast. So not the actual temperature, but the forecast. So this allowed them to print the forecast, obviously, somewhere showed on display, but they could also get an alert, dress more properly, the temperature drops rapidly tomorrow, or take an umbrella. There's a significant chance that there will be rain. And so that's the temperature graph here. As we can see, it drops to quite low. That's during the winter. If you can see those small numbers, I think it's -25 that we are reaching there. So it's not the worst we experience at the Zabbix homeland, but it's kind of not that pleasant. This is longer term, a bit more than 1 year. Here, maybe the interesting thing is that straight line at the middle of the graph. Slightly ironically, that line was caused by the machine which was doing this monitoring getting hit by lightning. So he didn't get that warning from the forecast. Well, it was fixed afterwards, obviously. Another less common use of Zabbix was done by one of the Zabbix team members again, and they were monitoring how well Zabbix is translated in different languages. So in this case, they were monitoring the Zabbix manual translations and seeing like which pages are outdated, which are up to date. This was not for very production use. This was just to integrate Zabbix with something maybe very uncommon for normal usage, and you could easily see in an overview how many pages. You could get statistics like how many are fresh, how many are a bit outdated, where the translators should work a bit more on them. While at this, they also were monitoring some issues that we were seeing with the documentation solution that we had, and there was something about the caching, where the different headers were incorrectly numbered based on the caching. So I usually put this picture up because of the shiny graph. Everybody just looks at the lines and they don't really hear what I'm saying, but it's a really nice one. But in general, it was showing how problematic the caching might be the way it was implemented back then. Still on the translators, you could also monitor how the individual translators were doing. So in this case, we are using Poodle for the as a web front end for the translators. So they are able to do the translation there in the web interface. If they like to, they can use PoEdit or whatever. And we can also monitor how well they're doing, how many suggestions or the actual submissions they have done to the translation. And the Zabbix team member, Zalex, he also did graphs for every translator to see how they're doing. And over time, you could see how they are rapidly adding to the amount of the translated strings or onto the submissions or to the suggestions. The increase at first indicates the initial translation effort, and then it kind of slows down because, well, if the translation is almost complete, there's not that much to do. That was obviously not a very important project, so you can see the gaps on this graph when he didn't pay attention to whether data is coming in or not, and then there's a bit missing. So besides monitoring the community as a whole or individual members, you can also monitor users. And this is the same community member, well, by now the Zabbix team member, monitoring how many tabs they have open in their browsers. As you can see, they have the same habit as I do with me having lots of tabs open, except that maybe I'm a bit more like trying to control this urge to have lots of things open and using the open tabs as bookmarks, as reminders, and then it drags on for years, and then your browser crashes and you lose all the open tabs. You're like, oh, I lost something. But okay, well, I don't have to look at all those like 100 tabs or whatever was there. Well, in this case, at one point he got to 80 open tabs in the browser, and then he started 2 browser sessions to kind of even it out. I don't know how things are for him now, whether he has learned to control this problem or not. But yes, you can monitor how many tabs your users have open in their browsers. Something that, again, most people would not really put in a monitoring solution, in a normal monitoring solution, but some users of Zabbix are monitoring the stock market with Zabbix. So this way, they can see how the prices are rising or falling in their tool of choice, and they can customize it, obviously, quite a lot. So this is showing you a daily stock value. There's a change in the stock, so you can see where it's going up or down. And there are probably tools which are way, way more better suited for this. But if you want to play with a monitoring tool and see what it can do and learn about it, then probably integrating with something uncommon is one way to do that quite well. Also, a pretty standard Zabbix view. And it, again, abused to display some stock market statistics. And in this case, there are these problem conditions that we call triggers in Zabbix added. And whenever the price is falling, I think that marks them as red. If it's OK, then it's green. You can click on the numbers. You can see the graphs and play with the values quite a bit. Another pretty uncommon use of Zabbix, at least that's the only case where I've seen Zabbix used in this capacity, is monitoring how many speed traps are on highways. So this is obviously interesting from all kind of different perspectives. You can see how many speed traps are usually being deployed at any given time across all the highways. You can see which highways are getting more of it. Obviously, you can get alerts for your daily route if you want to see that there's some speed traps up there. And interestingly, here, I think you could see that actually on weekends, there are less speed traps than on the working days, which might seem slightly surprising in a way, but I'm not sure how that is handled, how they do these decisions. But that's one of the facts you could probably get out of a bit strange graph like this. I mentioned the developer box being hit by lightning and there being this gap in the forecast data. Talking about lightnings, there's a company which is doing the monitoring itself that they do with Zabbix is not so unique, but the environment where Zabbix is used in is fairly non-common. And they, among lots of different sensors, they also provide lightning sensors. It's not a single sensor which just magically detects the lightning, but it's actually a whole system of different sensors. They have light, electromagnetic, sound, and probably a bunch of other sensors I half wouldn't even understand what they're doing. And there's a central system controlling all this, which has a display, a map, and then lots of different things. And on this central system, on each of the delivered products, they have a Zabbix instance running, which is monitoring all those sensors, monitoring the central system so that they actually can know that their lightning warning system is working properly. Such systems are usually used in industries which care about the lightning hitting something like electricity lines, maybe some forest management companies, and so on. And their system, they could detect lightning. I think the radius was like a couple of thousand kilometers if they don't have any precision limits. If they do precision to 200 meters, then it was reduced to 1,500 kilometers or something like that. So they could cover Europe with a couple of those systems, more or less. Another less common use of Zabbix or less common environment. There's a company monitoring projectors in cinemas, maybe not as old as this one, but the new ones, they actually have interfaces where you can monitor temperature, obviously, and probably a bunch of other parameters. Among them, also the expected lifetime for the lamp. The lamps in these large projectors, they're not that cheap, so they don't really buy them and stock them on the shelf. They want to buy them the last moment because they're very expensive. And with Zabbix monitoring thousands of cinemas, they can actually do this quite easily. And that's one of the environments where the Zabbix proxy is used. So Zabbix proxy is sitting in each location. If the communication between the cinema and the central site is down, then the proxy keeps on collecting the data. Once the communication is back up, they get all their temperature graphs, anything else that would be collected on those devices. Another area which is actually pretty common in general, but what is not common is the scale and the impact of this monitoring is the Tier 1, Tier 2, the ISP companies that are actually doing all the interconnects and everything else. There's quite a lot of those by now using Zabbix. And they have lots of devices, and they have also some of the things that they're monitoring, which usually people don't monitor when they do the network monitoring. And just one of the among of probably 1,000 different things they're doing some BGP monitoring. They have something about the failed information transfers. The great thing is that large part of the internet by this ends up being monitored by Zabbix. Well, okay, maybe the scary part as well, but still. Another use case that doesn't come out really well. That's supposed to show a seaport with the cranes from Riga, but it's a bit too dark, I guess. And I don't think we should switch off the light just to see the picture so you can imagine it. But there is a company who they were, as Zabbix is an open source solution, we don't really know how people are using it in detail in many cases. We just get these hints. It's used here, there. And yesterday I got a hint that Zabbix is used at some rather large and known company, which that was the first time for me to hear about it. So in this specific case, there's a company, they were planning at least to implement Zabbix and monitor the large industrial cranes in seaports. And those things they have, I was surprised by the amount of sensors they have. There's all kind of pressure, temperature, and whatnot, things on those, probably hundreds. So they would be monitoring these, and if some of the parameters are out of the range, they would obviously do some checks on them or maybe do some repairs. Another area where Zabbix is used by now quite a bit, we have a partner in Austria called Frequentist, which not many people have heard about, but they are providing communication and control systems for high-risk environments. So that would be police, ambulance, but their primary market is actually the airport or traffic control centers. So they're providing these integrated solutions, and that's including the hardware, software, the user terminals, everything. But given that it's a rather large solution, usually they also want to have some monitoring included, and they are shipping Zabbix with these tools. Their products are probably in the majority of the airports in Europe, so if you're flying in Europe, you're monitored by Zabbix. That part is scary. And if you are flying from the USA to Europe, then you're definitely monitored by Zabbix. Take that, Americans who are coming to Europe, that is. Another instance of Zabbix implementation which is not standard, there's a government agency in Brazil called Serpro, and they are providing IT services, IT solutions to other government institutions. It's a pretty large organization. I think there are like more than 10,000 employees there, and they are providing a bunch of things I have no idea about. But one of them is an aggregating monitoring solution, which is Zabbix, obviously. And what it's doing, it's not doing much of direct monitoring. It's actually collecting information from downstream instances of all kind of other monitoring solutions. They could be Zabbix, they could be something else. And on top of that, there is IT services SLA monitoring. The project is called Farol or something like that in Portuguese, which should mean lighthouse. So that's the Zabbix, the lighthouse aggregating everything upstream. Another interesting environment, and yet another interesting environment, you probably have heard about the OLPC project, the one laptop per child, where in some countries they are providing free small laptops like these to school children. And one of the biggest deployments is in Uruguay. I think by now they have distributed there for free more than 600,000 laptops, these small thingies. And they're not just giving them out just like that, they're also providing free Wi-Fi for all of those devices. And they have quite a lot of places where they provide this. They do this in libraries, school, and other environments. They wanted to monitor all of those places to see whether the Wi-Fi connectivity is working properly. So they decided to use Zabbix for this because of the Zabbix proxy. This meant that they could put the Zabbix proxy inside each of those environments, and if the connection between that environment and the central site would go down, they would still get all the statistics on what happened during that time. That is also, as far as we know, the environment with absolutely the biggest amount of Zabbix proxies. Some 5 years ago, we were like, well, if somebody's using a proxy at all, that's a large environment. 5 proxies, oh, that's a sizable environment. 10, that's a large environment. Then there was a French bank with 19 proxies. We were like, oh, that's a large environment now. And then came these guys. And they were like, I was asking them, so how many proxies do you plan to have? And they're like, 3,000. What? Funny. And then I think a year later, I asked them, like, I was a bit scared to ask it, but I still kind of pulled myself together and asked them, so how many proxies do you have now? Like, 2,500. We're still adding them. Like, and it works? Yeah, perfectly. So obviously for them, each environment is not a data center. It's like a school. Maybe there's a server, maybe a couple of access points, some switches, some routers. That's it. And in some really small places, there might be just an access point and maybe a switch, and that's it. But still, given that by now they have almost approached those 3,000 proxies with a single Zabbix instance, it's a quite surprising scaling for Zabbix, actually, because when I told this to the developers, they were like, no way. They didn't expect that to even work, actually. But it does. I mentioned how Zabbix is used in lots of Tier 1, Tier 2 providers to monitor their infrastructure. Have you heard about the ICANN, the organization that's giving out the domain names, how they now have the domain names for almost everything, if you can pay for that? So we had com.net.org, whatever it was, or gov for the USA government. Now we have, well, yeah, there's Paris, London, I think there's 3 X's, which is not used for porn, which is a bit sad. Well, not using these guys, but all those new top-level domains, they come with quite strict SLAs. How much of the DNS must be available, whose services, EPP services, which are used for updating the DNS information automatically by registers, and they are using Zabbix to monitor all that. So if some register or some of the top-level domain name providers is not meeting the SLA, then they might actually lose the rights to it. And given that they have to pay a few $100,000 USA dollars just for the rights, and then they have to pay for all the infrastructure, everything to actually meet those SLAs, that might be a pretty expensive thing to happen. So Zabbix is monitoring their main services according to the SLA requirements. And if I recall correctly, then for the DNS services, the SLA requirement was 100%. Just that they actually have to provide the redundancy and the amount of DNS servers so that it's always returning at least something. Slightly, maybe getting back into more common area, but a bit of a recursive thing, Zabbix also is used to monitor itself. And there's a built-in self-monitoring, which can give you things like the internal cache usage, how busy the processes are, to tell you how well your monitoring instance is doing. Without that self-monitoring, the solution might be a bit less maintainable, because that gives you lots of useful information, whether you should fine-tune it, whether you should improve it, whether you should fix something. This example shows actually the Zabbix database and the biggest tables and how that is growing. So you can probably figure out where some configuration is added, more data is being collected. I would expect that once the graph shows more than 10 months as it's doing currently, it would probably even out a bit, if not, if more data is not being added, because people tend to keep 1 year trend data with Zabbix. That's the long-term storage data. But in general, obviously, monitoring the table size or database sizes, that's pretty common. A bit less common is the thing that we have in the Zabbix office, and we're using SVN for the development, which is obviously fully available, including all the development branches and everything. And before the releases, during the release candidate phases, we freeze the branch, so it's not available for any commits unless it's like really important critical fix. In the Zabbix office, we are actually showing something like this with large numbers, and if a branch is frozen, then that branch name turns red. Very simplistic, but we can make Zabbix do this. If a new branch is added, it automatically appears here, so it's all probably future-proof as well. A few more things that we decided to use Zabbix. Well, we had to learn how it works, right? So we manually create development branches for different issues depending on what it is to be fixed and how we plan to fix it. So, but there's still some naming rules for these branches, and we have the monitoring. So if the branch isn't correctly named, it shows up together with the branch creator's name, so we know whom to blame, obviously. And if a branch exists but an issue is closed, which means that nobody is doing anything on it anymore, then that's wrong as well, because the branch should be deleted once the work on it has been completed. So that would show up as well. As we can see at this snapshot, everything was perfect in both of those areas. And sometimes the issue tracker that's referenced in the branch name, if the issue is not available for whatever reason, then that's not good either. That's not a good message to the community. So those are being shown up, and we can see there are 2 of those listed in this snapshot. At the bottom of the screen, which might not be that easy to see for everybody, but we also put up some community wiki edits, and this is all the Zabbix interface actually. So this is some custom data being retrieved from some place, from SVN or from the wiki, and then being pushed through the Zabbix. The coloring, that's not really a Zabbix feature. I'll have to admit that this is just inserting HTML tags and then allowing Zabbix to interpret that. So these are the things that we are doing in the Zabbix office in a less common way. Here's another less common thing in the Zabbix office. It's probably not easy to see at the bottom of the screen again, but here that's actually a weight sensor. So these water bottle racks, they're being monitored by that small weight sensor. Up there in the wall, there's the power plugged in, obviously, and there's an Ethernet cable plugged in. So that thing is being monitored by Zabbix. If it gets too light, which means that somebody should probably order a bit more water, then there's an alert being sent out. That was developed by one of the Zabbix team members, and he was walking around the office with that thing like, I have this pressure sensor. What can I do with it in the office? Something interesting. And there was a suggestion to put that beneath some developers' chairs, obviously, but, well, that wouldn't really work that well. There were some other ideas, but this seemed to be at least somewhat more practical thing. So that covers the less common uses, or at least the ones that I picked for today. And I'll move to the second topic, and that is about the changes that we have made in the last 2 years in the new releases. A quick overview. So looking back at my notes, at my slides and everything else, I figured out that the first time I visited this conference was back in 2009. And so since then, we have released 1.8. That was in 2009, which introduced the API and the passive proxies, which means the Zabbix proxy, the remote data collector, which is connected by the server. The active one connects to the server, and that's an old feature. So the passive one, which you can put in a DMZ, I could say it's a recent feature, but it's been like, what is it, 5 years by now, so it's not that recent feature anymore. In 2012, we had 2.0. As you can see, that took like 3 years almost. 2.5 years, which was quite a long time. So we introduced something called LLD. I'll touch on that a bit later, but the short version is that it allows you to discover entities on devices. So network interfaces, file systems, pretty much anything that can be displayed or interpreted as a list can be automatically discovered by the Zabbix agent or on SNMP devices. That version also introduced the Java gateway for the direct native built-in JMX monitoring. One thing which we presented as a feature, as an improvement, as a good thing in 2.0 was also dropping the support for Internet Explorer 6. We didn't get any negative comments about that whatsoever. 2.2 came out last year, and it didn't really introduce that many new features, as it removed a huge amount of minor annoyances. It improved the usability a lot. In the Zabbix frontend, for example, lots of things became interlinked. So you could click on things now and end up where exactly you would like to configure something else, not just like navigate through the interface and do things with drop-downs and other not so friendly things. There were feature improvements, obviously, but for me personally, those minor Minor changes seem to be more important. And 2.4 came out quite recently, and this one was similar, even though it added some large features, and I know that some people who are using Zabbix, they are really happy about some of the additional monitoring capabilities in 2.4. For me personally, there was one feature which I would call like maintainability or debuggability improvement, which is if I would do this for less technical people, I would probably not even mention it at all. But for me personally, I would probably classify as one of the most important changes in Zabbix from, well, as far as I can recall. And it's so minor to some, I'll try to demonstrate it a bit later. So I'm building suspense here, and then it's like, nothing. Briefly about the versioning. So the next version of Zabbix will be 3.0. And since 2.2, more or less, we have decided to introduce something called, we borrowed the concept, obviously, a long-term support release. A long-term support release gets really long-term support both for initially any fixes and then for the security or critical fixes like crashes or something like that. And the short-term releases, they are pretty much supported like briefly after the release of the next version. So 2.4 is the short-term release, 3.0 will be the LTS of Zabbix. Given that I promised to talk a bit more about the improvements during the last 2 years, I'll start with more details on 2.2. And as I mentioned, not all of these features that I will try to show you would appeal to the more management type people. But really minor thing which many users will not even see if they're only looking at the graphs in Zabbix. But that's an idea which came, I think, from Postgre and some other tools where the components are actually modifying their command line to display their status, what they're doing. So in this case, you can see the individual processes that are part of the Zabbix server daemon. There's trappers, spoilers, and other things. And they're constantly updating what they're doing, how long that took, and you can easily see this runtime. You can see whether they're stuck or how long it takes them to do each cycle. It's almost slightly addictive to look at, or I'm just strange in that way. So. So in this case, putting that in a watch, I can see that, in this case, this is a small Zabbix instance, so there's not a lot of things happening. But we can see how it's processing things, and they just take a different amount of milliseconds. And so in a larger Zabbix instance, this would be more interesting, obviously, because you could see there's a large amount of values being processed, and it takes maybe 3 seconds to process 1,000 values or something like that. So, as mentioned, if a user is looking at the graphs, this will be totally not interesting to them. If it's somebody trying to maintain a Zabbix instance, this can be very helpful. And why it's important is that you might have a product with thousands of nice features. And it will be perfect. It will work nicely most of the time. But then it will stop. If it will stop working once when you really need it and you will be unable to figure out what's wrong, then it's not of much use. So these maintainability, these features that allow you to actually figure out what's wrong when you really need it, I'm extremely happy about them. And one of these Zabbix developers, whenever he has some problem that he's like really not excited about, so when he sees some bug which is like, how could that get in? He uses the acronym SNAFL, if you know what that means. So some of you do. So you may use that, obviously, later, but the long version would be citation normal all fucked up. And this is exactly when you need it. When everything is broken, you need those small insights into what is broken. Another improvement in 2.2, Zabbix has quite a lot of built-in features. Among them, one is built-in web monitoring. So obviously, you can integrate anything. You can script things. You can use all kind of web testing monitoring toolkits and integrate them in Zabbix. But the built-in web monitoring was improved, and now you can use Zabbix templates with them. So if you have identical or similar websites, in older versions of Zabbix, you would have to either configure them manually or use the API to script them or something like that. Now it can be used even by not so technical people. They can just click around the front and create a template, link that to a larger amount of hosts which are representing the websites, and they're done. Web monitoring actually received large amount of improvements in that version. There's ability to specify how many times to retry and more control over the proxies. But I'll concentrate on the bigger things. Another bigger thing regarding web monitoring, in 2.2, we implemented ability to extract things from one web page and then reuse them in further steps. So you could get a session ID, use that in different page, or anything else that you would have to take from one page, and then you would be required to use that in another. We decided that this feature is so great that we should extend it to other capabilities of Zabbix, and one of those is the built-in log file monitoring. Sometimes you want to see the log entries, like whole entry. But there are some cases where you're interested in a specific number in that entry. So this is a slightly obscured example from a production environment. And in their case, there was the large result buffer allocation, and there was the entry number that they wanted to have. In older versions of Zabbix, this was actually implemented where you could not extract things from a log file entry. The trigger, the actual check whether the entry count is too large, was implemented using regular expressions. And they had several triggers. One was like it exceeds 10,000 but is below 15,000. Another was it's above 15,000, and try to write that with a regexp. It's doable, but it's not readable afterwards. And it's very easy to make mistakes there, and they're not easy to actually figure out. So Zabbix 2.2 allows you to specify this is an actual thing that you would use in Zabbix. The syntax is correct. And in this case, we're just matching the large result buffer allocation, then whatever that is, and then we're grabbing the entry number, parentheses, the group. The first group is in the output used, and well, that's it. You're getting your number. You can just compare it as a number instead of insane regular expressions. 2.2 also introduced the built-in VMVer monitoring support. Previously, of course, you could use lots of different methods to do it, but it was up to you in a way to choose which method to use and then to polish that integration. How exactly it works, the easiest way to how I explain this to people who don't actually want to use it themselves, they just want to know how does it work. I explain it, it's kind of magic. It just works. You know, you point it at the VMware, it works. If I would provide a bit more details, then it's using the VMVer API. That can be either a vSphere or a vCenter. So if you point it at a vSphere, it just discovers virtual machines. If you point it at a vCenter, it discovers the vSpheres and then all the virtual machines on all of them. And monitors, obviously, the VMs and also the vSpheres. Yeah, so it monitors them. All that, the discovery, the monitoring, all that is done using the VMVer API. It does seem to work pretty well. The initial implementation we had, it had this slight problem that it was not very efficient and it was querying the VMVer API quite a lot. And as we discovered, the VMVer API is, if you have access to it, you can kill it rather easily. As far as I know, there was at least one production environment that got crashed by Zabbix. And they had like almost 2,000 VMs, so it was a bit surprising. So we slightly changed the way we access the VMware API. Now it should work with thousands of VMs, although there are reports that if you exceed like 4,000 or 5,000 VMs, then it still has some performance problems. But on the Zabbix side, it's not crashing the VMware anymore. And we are working on improving that performance bottleneck as well. I mentioned that it had lots of smaller improvements, and there were lots of improvements that were done in the area of the maintainability. So we increased all kind of limits, like the URL limit that you can use in the web monitoring. So if you need a long URL or lots of the Git parameters, that's possible now. The usability improvements in the front-end side, you can do filtering like to show problems like this, problems like that, data. Give me data by the inventory values. Show me only hosts that actually have this specific CentOS version. For the web monitoring, I already mentioned the ability to specify retry count, quite detailed control over how the proxies are used. Something that should help new users, but not just new users, lots of improvements in different validation. That's both from the data that you enter in the Zabbix frontend, the validation of the configuration files. There was one specific example where somebody misconfigured the Zabbix server slightly. So you can specify how many processes we have of each type. And you can have processes that poll hosts normally, and then there are the ones that are polling the hosts if they are not reachable, to actually not overload the normal ones. And in older versions of Zabbix, you could configure 0 of those processes. So what happened was that if a host became unavailable, it was never checked anymore until you restarted the Zabbix server. And there was somebody who was struggling with that problem for months. And nobody could figure out why, because nobody could see that problem. Everything was working perfectly for developers, for everybody else. They could not provide details on why it fails. So this validation, among other things, that's one thing which is not allowed anymore. So if you are a new user to Zabbix, you should have a bit less of headache in that area. Performance is an important aspect that we're trying to improve, and we have configuration cache, we have some other caches which are reducing the database access, which was mentioned, I think, on the first day, about how the Zabbix instances, especially a few years ago, they almost needed like a full-time DBA. That should be a less of a concern now if you don't have a huge environment. And 2.2 introduced also something called value cache. What Zabbix does, it allows you to validate conditions not just like the last value and then do something based on last or then do some levels there. You can check. As in this example, it actually would check average over the last 5 minutes. That's a syntax from Zabbix that you would be able to use. You can use average, minimum, maximum. There's a count. There are deltas. A huge amount of, we call them trigger functions that you can use to actually check whether there's a problem or not. And in older versions of Zabbix, what would happen is that if it would need the values for 5 minutes, every time it would go to the database and say, give me the values for the last 5 minutes. It works okay with 100 hosts, with 5, maybe with 1,000 hosts. As that environment grows larger, you really need some more database power, because there's lots of these selects against the database, and they're very repetitive. So the value cache will actually only query database once at most. And then the new values that are arriving, if we need them, we know that, and we put them in the value cache directly. So we are not querying the values afterwards. They are in the value cache. 2.4, which was released, what is it, by now, some 3 or 4 months ago. So it's a pretty fresh still. One of the features that came in 2.4, in Zabbix, you can obviously have graphs. It's built in. It's all provided in the same open source package. You can click on a link. You just get your graph. You can create custom graphs, or you can add multiple things in a graph. But all that required some configuration, which was not available to normal users. 2.4 finally adds a convenience feature. You can just go to the page that displays you the latest values. You mark the checkboxes, and you just get your graph with whichever values were in there. And you can switch between normal and stacked graphs in the same page. Not a huge thing, but I've found that I use it quite a lot in the new version, actually. I mentioned the low-level discovery, which allowed Zabbix to discover things like file system network and network interfaces on a host. 2.4 also adds ability to discover the CPUs if you'd like to monitor something on all of them. And in older versions, you were able to filter by one parameter. So the common thing to do with the file systems was to filter by the file system type. You wouldn't need the TMPFS proc, sysfs, and probably, I don't know, a dozen more other things that, like C groups that might crop up. And that was usually fine, but in some cases, people didn't want to monitor things like exported file systems, or on Solaris, if it's something for the child zones, you didn't want to monitor those on the master zone. And now you can filter by pretty much any amount of things. So a common approach is to filter by the file system type, and also then filter by the mount point. So you only get to monitor the ones that you actually need. As I mentioned, the Zabbix agent, a brief advertisement for it. It's a native process, so we don't use Java or anything else. So it should use quite a little memory on the systems. As an example, on a 64-bit Linux system, excluding the shared libraries, it's using a bit more than 700 kilobytes of memory. That's including all the buffers it has. So it could be less to have people working with embedded environments saying that that's a huge amount of memory. But for a normal server nowadays, that's probably not a huge problem. And these agents, they can obviously be extended again, as with anything in Zabbix, with some scripts or modules. But they have more than 70 different things built in, and there are more things being added with every new version. So whether it's the process statistics, memory, disk, CPU, all that is out of the box, and there's a very simple protocol that is used to interact with them. Currently, it's not encrypted natively. So if you would need encryption, then, well, what people usually do, they have some tunnel or VPNs or something like that. 2.4 improved additionally the built-in web monitoring. And what's possible now, you can specify any custom header. So in older versions, if you wanted to monitor, let's say, some API endpoint which needed specific content type, it was not possible. Or if you wanted to monitor after behind a load balancer a specific server with a specific website, it was not easily possible. You could hack it, but it was pretty ugly. Very easy now with the new version. Just specify the headers and you're done. Also, the SSL authentication, both client and the server-side verification. You just mark the checkboxes and decide, verify this, use this key to authenticate, everything works. There are some built-in graphs for the web monitoring. This one is showing a couple of months of or 3 months, almost 3 months of the OpenStreetMap.org monitoring. There was some improvement in the speed at some point. But all those values, they are normal values that you can reuse in your own graphs. You can have all kind of alert conditions against them. So it's pretty flexible behind the scenes as well. One thing which is very, very minor, but it took me a long time to actually get that thing unified in Zabbix. It's this. Anybody recognizes that number? Yes. That was the old one. And it really drove Americans like nuts. Seriously. They were like, what is that? I was like, I agree. That sucks. So we changed it to this. That should work everywhere. If you can't figure that out, then you're probably, well, I don't know. Nothing will help that we can do. But this was unified in the forms. This was unified in the value representation. So it's now the same almost everywhere. There are some exceptions on the graph axis where we just don't have enough space. We couldn't design it properly still. But now they will sort properly if you would copy and paste them somewhere else. And it's just like...
So if it's September, it'll be 09, so it'll sort based upon 0.
Well, the sorting already happens in the Zabbix interface, but if you would take that data and then, I don't know, sort it in some spreadsheet, then you would not have to mess with the date formats and try to transform them. So this is an absolutely sane thing, and everybody should do that. Unfortunately, not everybody does that, but finally, Zabbix is in the sane camp. It might seem like a minor thing, but these minor things that impact the usability a lot, they can really drive you away from product. And now that minor thing, which is my favorite in 2.4, which, as I mentioned, I wouldn't really show to people who are only looking at the graphs and not really maintaining anything, but it's the ability to change the log level runtime for any Zabbix daemon. You can also do that for individual Zabbix processes. And you may also now dump whatever data was received from a web page with the built-in web scenario, which previously was not easily possible. You could do TCP dump or something like that, but if it was an encrypted web page, that was an extra problem there. And the same with the VMVer. So VMVer monitoring, the magic, the thing that works, it's great when it works. When something doesn't work, you really want to know why. You want to know what that API returned. And this new capability allows you to runtime just bump up the log level, and you will see all that XML that comes from that, what is it, SOAP interface or something like that. It's a massive XML. It's like really in megabytes, but at least you can have it now. This is important because with Zabbix, people don't really like to restart the daemons. They are mighty stable, actually. So a Zabbix server can easily run for months, if not longer. Usually there's an upgrade that people want to do, so they do the restart every now and then. But I have seen Zabbix servers that have been running for almost a year nonstop, so it's not an issue. And So one thing is that people don't like to restart them. Another is that with all the caching, it might take a while to repopulate those caches after a restart, especially if you have a large installation. Actually, it may take even like 15 minutes until it resumes like the normal operations. So ability to change these log levels runtime, they can help a lot to figure out what's wrong. And well, that's still running. So in this case, I would use the Zabbix server to send a signal and increase the log level of the Zabbix server daemon. I can do that for all the processes. If I would skip this part here, starting with equal sign, that would just bump the log level for everything. I can specify a specific process type. We looked previously at the processes. There was polar, trapper, there was self-monitoring, bunch of different things. You can also increase the log or decrease the log level for any given process type. So for all the polars, it will be just polar. And you can also increase or decrease the log level for a specific process. So by default, we have 5 polars, and let's say I'd like to increase the log level for process number 3 in that stack of polars. So in this case, let's say I'll be increasing it for one specific polar, and it's now giving me quite a lot of data. And you can see there are some items being queried, network statistics, mostly network statistics so far. And imagine doing this in a large instance. In older versions, you had to do a restart, and the log level was the same for all the processes. So it would dump like massive amounts of data. As of one example, it would give you all the SQL queries against the database for all the processes. And on the Zabbix IRC channel, there was somebody who got the idea, okay, you can change the log level, and in the configuration file it says it logs a lot or something like that. And he went back like, oh, it didn't, it was really right, it really logs a lot. So this allows you to be more specific about what you want to debug. And so if I would now decrease the log level for this single process, it prints out that it was decreased, and as you can see, it's very silent. Actually, this installation probably would not print anything at all. If I would now do the same, but for all the processes, so I will increase the log level for all of this, and I'll remind you that this is a very, very small Zabbix instance. So now it's doing something like this. Even a small Zabbix instance can log in like a couple of minutes several megabytes of data. A large instance, like 15 minutes, it already has a gig or something like that. So being able to specify what you want to see helps a lot. So yesterday we were discussing at the evening event, and somebody mentioned that if that's the best feature that I can advertise, then it's probably not a huge improvement. But as I said, this is for the people who want to know how it works and who want to figure out how the problems might be happening. And I just like that feature. Well, okay, let's decrease it. In general, it's limited, so it would rotate the log file. It will not fill the disk. That's a default, but I would agree, yes. So now, yeah, let's drop it for all of the processes. So they all printed out that they are dropping the log level, and it's now silent again. As I'm talking about the new versions, I'll mention briefly the upgrade policies of Zabbix, as it's using the database as a backend both for the configuration data and for the collected values. That database, the schema obviously changes from one version to another, but it doesn't change inside one major release. So if you are using, let's say, 2.2, you go to 2.2.7, you don't have to change anything. You can go back and forth. It all works nicely. If you would go to 2.4, you just start the latest version of Zabbix server. It will start up and upgrade the database automatically for you. That will involve all the schema changes, the data migration, any transition that's needed. Everything is fully automatic. And this morning, Taurus had a slide on the oldest open source monitoring projects. There were a few of them in 2001. including OpenNMS and Zabbix. And Zabbix supports all the old agents with the latest server back to 2001. So if you installed Zabbix back then, you had 1.0 agent or even pre-1.0 whatever agent, really ancient. It will still work with 2.4 Zabbix server, with 3.0 with anything that's coming out. We've had some discussions about whether it's still needed, but we're like, well, okay, it's not that critical to support them. So you don't have to upgrade the agents when you are upgrading the main server or proxies or the front end. Some time ago, a Zabbix user from Germany on RC, he told me that one of his colleagues has discovered a really serious bug in Zabbix, and he promised to give me a screenshot a moment later, which he did. So apparently, if you are staring at graphs all day, you probably get a bit like artistic. And Zabbix, again, it's open source. It's a true open source. So you can get everything that we have. You can play with it. You can use it. You can use it in commercial setting, whatever. You can resell the services. And if you'd like to try it out in an easy way, obviously, there's packages for different distros that you could do. There's source archive. Everything's available. The easiest way might be the virtual appliance. So it's based on OpenSUSE, and you can just start it up. There will be Zabbix server agent frontend. It will not have the Java gateway or the proxy or some other things, but most of the features that are available, they will be like out of the box with the virtual appliance. So play with that. Zabbix also has a mostly friendly community, and I'm saying mostly because some of the IRC channels can be like quite. They test your like durability, how stable you are emotionally. Zabbix channel is not like that most of the time. There are some exceptions, but most of the time, it's for IRC, it's very friendly. OpenLDAP was mentioned here. Yeah, well, the bash channel, it's very helpful, but you have to have a bit thicker skin than maybe, I don't know, some people. So yeah, Zabbix on Freenode, very easy to remember. So drop in by. Most of the advanced community members will be found there. The packagers, the people who are actually doing large installations, people working for huge companies. I probably will not be able to name most of those companies, but they sometimes drop the names on IRC. You can see from the IP addresses who's there, so you can figure out which of those large companies are into Zabbix. There's forum if you're a forum person, and there's a blog if you would like to see maybe a bit more on the technical side or the social side, depending on which one we are more blogging about. IRC is my personally preferred communication channel, so I usually advertise this picture, which is also showing how you can use Zabbix to monitor non-standard things. So this is monitoring how many users are in the Zabbix IRC channel. I lost the log files for the very first few, whatever that was, years, I think, when the channel was started, but since then you can see that the user count in IRC has increased quite rapidly. It's mostly active during the European day, but there's some slight shift, so it's actually covering at least the American morning definitely now as well. And this graph shows almost 8.5 years. So that is easy to graph with Zabbix as well. In this case, it was generated in 0.67 seconds. That's a runtime graph. We don't pre-generate graphs. You just click on a graph, you choose the time period, and it's like, well, usually, sometimes like. And
is that Christmas? Is those holidays?
You mean those drops? Yeah. That's net splits. Sometimes you can see Christmas like being a bit down on the global change, but those trends there, where it starts to go up or starts to even out, I can't explain them. On one year on Christmas, it kind of goes down. Next year, it goes up. And then something happens in the summer, and one year it's like this, one year it's the opposite way. If somebody wants to have that, this data is publicly available on Zabbix.org. You can just go there, grab the data, and try to analyze that. I looked at it, and I can't figure it out. And talking about RC, if you look at something like Google Trends, you will see that the Nagios popularity is dropping, Zabbix is climbing. It's not reaching that yet, but it's going there. But there is one thing that I can actually show you, which is nicer, which is like the IRC channel user count. This is This is from yesterday around like noon or something like that. So the Zabbix community on RC is good. So if you have any questions.
Thank you. I've for a few months experience in a Zabbix environment which I'm building up, but I'm especially interested in the capability of the web scenarios if a feature is planned. I think in the past, if I queried web pages, no images were downloaded and measured from the download speed. Will this change, or will there a possibility to also download and measure the speed of connected content and images?
So yeah, currently the built-in web monitoring only downloads the page itself. It doesn't download the included elements. It's not on the roadmap, unfortunately. But if you go to our issue tracker, we're using Jira for that. There might be an existing feature request which you can vote on or follow it. If not, then please create a new one. But make sure to search for duplicates first, obviously. So unfortunately, currently not planned, at least not in the near future.
Okay, maybe another question. In the item sections, where I can manage all the items for all hosts, I have excellent filter possibilities. Will all these possibilities also come to the trigger section?
There definitely is a feature request like this. And it has been discussed quite a lot. It's maybe a bit more likely than the web scenario improvement you mentioned, but it's currently not on the roadmap, as far as I know. But I'd have to check the 3.0 roadmap in more detail. But I don't recall it being on the roadmap yet.
Thank you.
Any more questions about Zabbix, agents, capabilities? Well then, thank you. And try the virtual appliance, hang out in RC. If you have any questions, I'll be here till the end of the day, most likely. So catch me, ask me questions. Thank you.